Tim Dyson was born in 1949 and educated at the University of Sussex and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. He has been on the faculty of the London School of Economics since 1980, and today is Professor of Population Studies in the International Studies Institute there. He has also made research visits to the Australian National University, the Institute for Developing Economies in Tokyo, and the American University of Beirut. He has done extensive consulting for United Nations agencies, especially regarding the population of India. This article, published in 2011 in the Population Council's journal, Population and Development Review, updates earlier literature on the urbanization process with special attention to the effects of changing birth and death rates in urban and rural areas. The article is important because it reinforces the idea that urbanization involves more than just migration from rural to urban locations, and also because it highlights a dramatic difference between urban population growth during classical urbanization in Europe a century ago, contrasted with contemporary urban growth in third world countries. Tim Dyson reminds us of a very significant difference between pre-industrial cities in earlier times and the cities of modern urban societies. He starts his article with a 1662 quote from John Graunt, who observed that 4 centuries ago there were more deaths than births in London, and that the population of the city would have dwindled away and disappeared without constant in-migration from the countryside. Other writers also have noted that cities once were population sinks, but Dyson makes this one of the central points of his article. Building on the work of Sam Preston and others, Dyson aims to consider both urban growth, which looks only at how big cities themselves are, and urbanization, which considers the balance between urban and rural populations. After stressing the difference between these two concepts, he then tackles the issue of urbanization. He refers to Geoffrey Williamson's study of England, citing it as an example of the focus on the urbanization experience of Western Europe and North America as a kind of standard model of the process. In this standard model, urbanization happens because the nature of work in a society changes. Industrialization creates new kinds of jobs in cities and also industrializes agriculture to some extent, meaning that fewer workers are needed to produce larger crops. In this model, industrialization, or economic growth in general, is the cause, and population shifting from countryside to cities is the result. What troubles many scholars, though, as we will see in future readings, is that sometimes we can observe this result of urbanization apparently happening without the cause of industrialization and economic development. In a true cause and effect relationship, things like that should not happen. Dyson's approach to this apparent paradox is simply to forget about the whole issue of industrialization and economic development for a moment, and to concentrate instead on the strictly demographic aspects of the process of urbanization. As he puts it, quote, "Ultimately, a population can only experience the process of urbanization as a result of demographic processes. In other words, the composition of a population can only change from being predominantly rural to being predominantly urban through the operation of mortality, fertility, and migration," unquote. These words echo the approach of Williamson to the urbanization of England. To go into more specific details about how these demographic aspects of the process interact, Dyson borrows a model and a diagram from the work of Jan de Vries, a Berkeley historian specializing in study of the Industrial Revolution. Represented by Figure 1 on page 39 of the article, Dyson calls this a sector-specific model of birth and death rates. The sectors he is talking about are simply the rural population and the urban population in a society. For each of these two sectors of the population, curves in this figure represent trends in birth and death rates over time. Time itself is divided into 3 stages, and readers familiar with the model of the demographic transition from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates will easily recognize the overall picture. What is special about de Vries' model, though, is that usually such a picture of the demographic transition only has one curve for the birth rate and another for the death rate, while here we see separate curves for rural areas and urban areas. What is more, the trends over time in these vital rates look very different for rural areas compared to urban areas. This is the heart of Dyson's argument, so it's a good idea to take a moment to make these differences clear. During the first stage of this process, as shown in his figure 1, Dyson suggests that the death rate in cities, his orange line, is higher than the birth rate, his blue line, so that the urban population is always in danger of shrinking away to nothing unless people move into the city, just as Grant observed for England in the 1600s. During this pre-transition stage, Dyson points out that the constant erosion of city population means that there is a ceiling on how urbanized a society can get, depending on how much rural population growth can be siphoned off into the city to replace the natural decrease caused by the high death rate there. During this first stage, the rural birth rate is higher than the death rate, and the rural population therefore experiences natural increase. This increase allows some people to move to the city without actually reducing the population in the countryside. In fact, the rural birth rate is also higher than the urban birth rate in this model, although this does not need to be the case in order for Dyson's basic logic to work out. Then things begin to change. In particular, they begin to change first and fastest in the cities, and these changes mainly involve a steep drop in the death rate. Dyson doesn't say too much about how or why this mortality decline happens, other than to mention a reduction in infectious diseases. Williamson already showed us an additional reason why this can happen if the migrants to the city are mostly young adults with very low risks of dying. But such a rapid decline in urban death rates also suggests that some major changes in health conditions must be taking place. At some point, the urban death rate falls below the urban birth rate, which means that the urban population will also begin to grow by natural increase. For Dyson, this marks the beginning of stage 2 in the transition process. Now the cities are growing both by net in-migration from the countryside and also from an excess of births over deaths. The rural population also continues to grow by natural increase. Meanwhile, sometime after the death rates begin to fall, the birth rates also begin to decline in his abstract model. Dyson always shows the rural birth rate slightly higher than the urban birth rate, but again there's no real requirement for this to be the case. In any event, these birth rates eventually decline to low levels in both the urban and rural sectors. Again, Dyson doesn't say too much at this stage of the article about how and why the birth rates decline. Eventually, the urban death rate even falls below the rural death rate, making the cities grow even faster. And this is the point where Dyson marks the beginning of the third stage of the transition. Once this happens, if urban and rural birth rates are both declining together, the rate of natural increase in urban areas can actually become faster than the natural increase of the rural population, just as Williamson observed in England. If that happens, it means that the country will be urbanizing, that is, the share of people found in cities will be increasing, even if no one migrates from farms to cities at all. The different rates of natural increase will cause cities to grow faster than the rural population. The example that Dyson gives us to show that his abstract model actually seems to describe the urbanization process as it happened in specific places comes from Sweden during the 200 years between 1750 and 1960. He presents a table of crude birth and death rates and the resulting rates of natural increase or decrease for the urban and rural sectors of Sweden's population, measured every 10 years for 2 centuries. As he notes in the article, very few countries on Earth can offer detailed long-term statistics like this, and Sweden often ends up being the poster child for long-term historical statistics. It can be hard to visualize trends just by looking at columns of numbers in a table, so Dyson also translates all these numbers into the trend lines shown in his figure 2 on page 43 of the article. These lines are not as neat and tidy as the abstract trends sketched in his first figure, but his basic argument is that we can see something like that first figure here, of course distorted by special historical circumstances, if we just use our imaginations a little. For one thing, the shaded area he labels A in this figure for Sweden shows a period up to about 1850 when, in fact, the death rate was higher than the birth rate in Swedish cities, so that they were population sinks in need of a steady supply of replacements from the countryside. Compounding this problem, the urban birth rate was also lower than the rural birth rate during this period. After 1850, the death rate in cities fell below the birth rate in cities, and urban natural increase appeared as a new component of urban growth and urbanization. Just as Williamson showed for England, the migration of young adults into Swedish cities also biased the urban birth rate upward and the rural birth rate downward, so that the urban birth rate rose higher than the rural rate for a few decades. The urban death rate in Sweden continued to decline until by 1900 it actually dropped below the death rate in the countryside, indicated by the D arrow in Dyson's figure 2. In the second half of the 19th century, driven by urban natural increase as well as rural to urban migration, the share of Sweden's population found in cities roughly doubled from 10 to 20% of the total. Then, after 1900, with higher natural increase in cities than in the countryside, and with continued migration into cities, the percent urban more than doubled again, reaching almost 50% of the total population by 1950. So in the Swedish case, Dyson makes a fairly good argument for the idea that his abstract model of stages gives a good description of a real example of urbanization. This example comes from what we might call the first wave of urbanization and economic development, focused on Western Europe and North America. Right from the start in his article, though, he also pays attention to the major problem that he and other scholars face, the problem that sometimes urbanization seems to happen without economic development. So after he considers the Swedish case, he deliberately sets out to find a second example, a more recent process of urbanization taking place in a different part of the world, so that we can see if the urbanization process works in essentially the same way when it is not accompanied by a parallel process of economic development and industrialization. His second example comes from Sri Lanka, the island nation off the southeast coast of India, once known as Ceylon. British colonial rule aimed at exploiting the spices, tea, and tropical forests of the island also generated some statistical evidence about population from the Office of the Colonial Registrar General. So we are able to look at data presented as trend lines in figure 3 on page 46 of the article, even if it is only for about 80 years instead of 2 centuries. To his relief, Dyson finds that the transition stages of his abstract model also seem to fit pretty well to the actual trends in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon as it was known for most of the studied period. Again, we see an initial period ending sometime shortly after 1920, when the urban death rate was higher than the urban birth rate, so that the island cities would have been losing population if not for regular replacements from the countryside. Also, as in Sweden, at the beginning of this process, 11% of the population of the island lived in cities, a typical level of urbanization for a pre-industrial society. Then, early in the 20th century, the urban death rate declined below the birth rate, and the cities began to grow by both natural increase and net in-migration. Note that none of Dyson's data or figures give any actual evidence about the actual size of such migration streams. However, the urbanization of the total population remained at only about 13% by 1925 and only 17% even by 2001, although Dyson suggests the percentage would be a little higher if the growth of rural villages into small cities were taken into account. Eventually, after about 1950, the urban death rate even drops below the rural death rate, 50 years later than the same crossover in Sweden. So Dyson is able to claim that his conceptual model, sketched in figure 1, seems to be a good description of the demographic stages of relative population growth in urban and rural areas, whether we're looking at a classic case, of urbanization and industrialization from Europe more than a century ago, or a contemporary case of urbanization from a developing country in more recent decades. These two examples of Sweden and Sri Lanka are as important, though, for the differences they show us as they are for the way they both seem to fit Dyson's general abstract model. Stages of Dyson's general model of vital rates do seem to describe the urban and rural trends in both Sweden of the 1800s and Sri Lanka in the 1900s. There are some important differences between the two cases. He gives us one hint about these differences in his reporting of the resulting level of urbanization in the two countries. The percent urban started out in each country at about 10% of the total population, as normally found in pre-industrial societies. However, over the course of the transition that he sketches for us, the population of Sweden became 50% urban, crossing the boundary into a modern urban society. By comparison, in Sri Lanka, this did not happen. Despite rapid urban population growth, the country remained predominantly rural, with less than a quarter of the total population found in cities, even if we allow the definition of urban to shift over time to include places that once were rural. It is not hard to guess why Sri Lanka stayed mostly rural when Sweden did not. To see this most clearly, we only need to take the figures from the two tables in Dyson's article and rearrange them to compare the two countries on the same graph. First, consider what we see if we put the urban birth and death rates for both countries on a single graph. The blue lines are for Sweden and the red lines are for Sri Lanka. The circles that are filled in represent birth rates and the hollow circles represent death rates. No years are shown on the horizontal axis because the time intervals are different for the two countries. Instead, the two series are matched so that the time when urban death rates cross over and fall below urban birth rates are matched for the two countries. 1856 for Sweden and the early 1920s for Sri Lanka. The two series of hollow circles for urban death rates actually follow almost identical tracks after this crossover point in the two countries. But the different trends in urban birth rates stand out in sharp relief in this figure. While birth rates in Sri Lanka's cities actually were lower than in Swedish cities prior to the crossover of vital rates, after this crossover point, the Sri Lanka urban birth rate increased higher and higher with each passing decade, while in Sweden, birth rates began to decline almost immediately after the crossover point. After half a century or more of urban growth by both natural increase and net migration, the birth and death rates in Swedish cities were almost balanced and provided almost no ongoing natural population increase. In stark contrast, the rising birth rate combined with the falling death rate in Sri Lanka's cities to produce larger and larger rates of natural increase in the urban population with each passing decade, eventually exceeding growth rates of 20 per thousand per year, even without any consideration of additional growth due to rural immigrants into these cities. We see a similar dramatic difference if we compare rural birth and death rates in the two countries on a single graph. Again, the Swedish and Sri Lanka death rates decline over time and end up at fairly similar levels, even though the Sri Lanka death rate in rural areas were above those in Sweden during most of the studied intervals. But we also see that the rural Swedish birth rate was always much lower than in Sri Lanka, and that it declined much more dramatically over time, so that just as for Swedish cities, by the end of the observation period, the rate of natural increase in the Swedish countryside also dropped to a very low level. Sri Lanka's rural birth rate was much higher than in Sweden, and also gave very little indication of any decline, even after the urban and rural death rates had crossed over in the 1920s. By the end of the observation period, the rural population of Sri Lanka had the same huge gap between birth and death rates and the same rapid natural increase observed in the cities. Since the rural rate of natural increase was even faster than that in cities, Sri Lanka couldn't urbanize much at all. The rapid natural increase of urban populations left little room for rural migrants to find any jobs, and the rural population itself continued to grow at an incredible, unsustainable rate. This is the message of what happens when urbanization is not accompanied by economic development. Sri Lanka has not finished the demographic transition to low birth as well as death rates and remains trapped by runaway population growth. Despite rapidly growing city populations, the country is not urbanizing in the strict sense of the word because the rural population is growing even faster than the population in urban areas. This picture of city growth without economic development was of such concern to many scholars that it gave rise to a whole separate body of research focused on urbanization in the Third World.